All right, everyone. Welcome to Fiveable and welcome to AP Government. If you guys could hear me, if you could just put something in the chat just so I know I'm not talking to myself. Today we're going to be reviewing Unit 1 of the AP Government syllabus, which is Foundations of American Democracy. This will be a part of your AP exam, and I will go over some of the updates that they put out now almost, I guess, 2 or 3 weeks ago in terms of what will be tested right at the beginning. So if at any time you have any questions during the presentation, if you could ask it in the Ask a Question tab at the bottom. Of course, you guys can talk on the chat. It's just easier for me to see if you ask it in the little button thing, because I'm like navigating between a few tabs as I present. So let's go ahead and get started. This is our weekly stream calendar. So this is, if you ever want to attend a Fiveable stream, this is what you should reference. More updated schedules are available on our website, so you can see our AP Government fits into 9 p.m. on Tuesdays. Also, you can join us for our 8:30 p.m. current event stream on Mondays. So every Monday at 8:30 p.m., myself, Fatima, and Brandon, who's on the AP Lang team, it's a collaboration between our AP Gov and AP Lang stream teams. So we try to give you some pointers in both subjects throughout our stream. So over the past few weeks, we've kind of shifted it towards a COVID-19 and election update. Normally before that, it was just a current events and election update, but it's a lot more interesting now that we have the COVID-19 situation to talk about. As you guys know, or probably know, we are offering cram sessions, and those are if you paid for them. All content on Fiveable is free and can be accessible for free. However, these cram sessions are one thing that are paid, and it's the only thing that are paid for. So they're basically live streams hosted by experienced teachers, AP graders, in each content area. And so if you are a cram member, the Unit 2 review for interactions among branches is going to be tomorrow and the 27th, and then Supreme Court cases is going to be on the 29th. If you do not have a cram pass, do not worry, because we will still be doing review sessions every Tuesday at 9. So I'll be back next week with a Unit 3 review on civil liberties and civil rights. So I believe Unit 2 has already been covered, which is why we're going from 1 to 3. But yeah. And always make sure to follow Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and also on TikTok. So it's the same handle at Think Fiveable, I believe, and Brandon, who I mentioned does the current event streams, is actually the one that runs that. So make sure to check out TikTok. Just to introduce myself, my name is Akhilesh, and I'm a junior from Charlotte, North Carolina. I love politics, and I took AP Gov as a sophomore, so last year I got a 5 on the exam, and I'm really excited about Fiveable. So in terms of what we're going to be talking about during the stream, we are going to go through all 9 standards that are covered in Unit 1. But first, I want to start out with the FRQ specifics that were released on April 3rd. So your exam date, basically for everyone in the world, is May 11th at 4 p.m. Eastern, and then you can kind of convert your time zone. And if you cannot take it at that date, you need approval from your school's AP coordinator or someone from your school that you can take it on a late testing date, which is on June 1st, I believe. So they do have late testing dates for every single exam in case your situation makes it so that you can't take it on the 11th. The first question is an argumentative essay, which is worth 60% of your score. That is very similar to the FRQ number 4 that was on the traditional AP exam. And then your timing for that is going to be 25 minutes and then a 5-minute upload time. And then question 2 is going to be your concept application, which is 40% of your exam score, and it's 15 minutes and then a 5-minute upload time. And this is very similar to what is FRQ number 1 on the traditional exam. In terms of units and what is going to be covered on this AP exam, it's only going to be Unit 1 through 3. So if you've come to any of my streams before, you know that I've said like they're basically making it AP US government and taking out the and politics part because all the politics stuff is covered in 4 and 5. So basically it's all the government stuff that you've learned. So it's Unit 1 through 3. If your teacher hasn't followed that order, this stuff, Unit 1, what we're going to talk about is basically like all the history behind it. It's basically stuff that you probably learned in US history and a little bit more just about democracy. Unit 2 is like all the 3 branches of government, checks and balances, and bureaucracy, stuff like that. Then Unit 3 is basically civil liberties and civil rights. So a little bit more focus on the judicial branch, and a lot of your Supreme Court cases come in Unit 2 and 3. So this is like my little graphic for Unit 1 and what we're going to be talking about. The first two standards cover like what is democracy, so what are the ideals of democracy and what are the types of democracy. 3, 4, and 5 cover the key foundational documents, including some of the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers, Articles of Confederation, the Constitution. 1.6 is kind of different from the other ones. It talks about principles of U.S. government, but a lot of it is repeated in the other standards. And then the last 3 standards talk about federalism. So does anyone have any questions so far in terms of what's going to be on the AP exam or anything? So you guys, if you want, you can ask questions. I mean, really any unit, and I'll do questions that don't pertain to this unit at the end. And I'll try to address any other question as I keep going. Okay, so if there are no other questions, we will get started with content. So the first standard is 1.1, which is the ideals of democracy. So as you guys probably have heard of, the Enlightenment was a time period, and it's basically when the framers of the Constitution lived, or what they were inspired by. Okay, so during this time, traditional political views and acceptance were challenged. So before this, as you know, we came out of Britain, and Britain was a monarchy. Most governments at that time were of that structure. That concept of democracy really wasn't very prevalent. Enlightenment kind of forced people to think about not using religion as a basis for everything, and really digging deeper into like why we believe the way we do, and why you can't just trust someone's word if they say like almost like the mandate, like a God's mandate kind of thing, and you shouldn't trust that. So Enlightenment really changed our way of thinking, and it changed the relationship between people and government. So this was clear in American colonies, and there were several Enlightenment thinkers that inspired these framers. So in the Declaration of Independence, and the Enlightenment ideas were used as justification in terms of why we should get freedom from Britain. Okay, so continuing with 1.1, the Declaration of Independence is one of your foundational documents. So I believe there are 9 foundational documents that are covered on your AP exam, and those are all pertaining to the argumentative essay, FRQ. So in your argumentative essay, you're going to have to use some of these foundational documents as evidence. Okay, so that's why it's really important that you know them. If you go back to a Q&A stream that I did probably 2 weeks ago, you can find a video of me going through all of the foundational documents on basically one document. So I would highly suggest watching that, or making some kind of one-pager or guide for each document, even printing out like an abridged version or like an English version. I mean, they're all in English, but like something that's easier for you to understand, because I know when I was reading them, that's hard enough to kind of make stuff out with the old English kind of ways that they use. So continuing on with Declaration of Independence, it was drafted by Thomas Jefferson, and it provides a foundation for popular sovereignty. So does anyone know what popular sovereignty is? If you could answer in the chat, that would be great. I'm hoping, or I'm assuming most of you guys do have an idea at least of what popular sovereignty is. Okay, so I'll start talking, and hopefully, yes, Sandra, when the people are active in government, yes. So really it's when the government is inspired by the people, and the people are the ones that have a voice in government. So like popular, like depopulation, I guess that's a way you could remember. The Declaration of Independence, basically what it did was complain. It detailed abuses by the crown and talked about why the United States wanted to be apart from Britain, and justified the American Revolution. Now, the U.S. Constitution is kind of like the second Constitution. We'll talk about the Articles of Confederation and why that was like an epic failure later. But the U.S. Constitution is what provides an American blueprint for democracy. And obviously, as you guys know, it's still the law of the land today. So they did a really good job of making sure a lot of stuff was taken into account. It was drafted along with help from Washington, Madison, and Hamilton. So that's just something from the guide that they wanted you to know. in terms of people that were involved. Okay, so we're going to talk again later in the stream about principles of American government, but it's really important that you know the definitions of these early on, so that you can expand on that later when we go into more detail. So one of the main key principles is natural rights. So natural rights is the concept of life, liberty, and property. The thinker that inspired natural rights is Locke. In our own Declaration of Independence, it was edited into life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. As you know, at that time, slaves were not allowed to own property. Basically, anyone that wasn't a white male was not allowed to own property. So that could have been one of the reasons why they chose not to keep life, liberty, and property. Instead, they changed it to pursuit of happiness in the Declaration. Popular sovereignty, like I said before, basically the power of a state lies within the people. The people have the power in the government, like Sandra said a few minutes ago. The thinker that inspired this was Rousseau. And then republicanism, this is basically a representative style of government. Republicanism is not equal to democracy. A democracy, or a pure democracy, which we'll talk about later, or you might have heard it called a direct democracy. It's basically when the people themselves vote on every single decision. Now that's like impossible because we're a country now like 300 something million. Every single person voting on an issue would be impossible. So that's why we have a Republican style of government, where it's a representative based. So you, as the people, directly elect your representatives, and the representatives are the ones that make decisions on behalf of you. And then separation of powers. So separation of powers kind of goes in with that. And that talks about how we divide the three branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. So that's something really from Unit 2. But checks and balances is a theme that's consistent throughout this course, so you should make sure that you are aware of that. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is the social contract theory. If you were in any kind of civics or U.S. history class, you probably heard this term used. But it's basically when there's a contractual agreement between the rulers and the people that are being ruled. The agreement is basically to protect their natural rights, which for us are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And basically what it says is that if the people feel that the person that's ruling is not upholding that agreement, then they have the ability to rebel or protest, kind of thing. So their opinion is heard. And yeah, so that's 1.1. Does anyone have, I know I went through that a little bit fast, but does anyone have any questions in terms of what are the ideals of democracy? How does democracy work? All right, so let's go ahead and move into Unit 1.2, which is types of democracy. I believe there are three main types of democracy that we're going to focus on in this stream, and those are the three that are outlined by College Board. So the first one is a participatory democracy. Based on the word, what do you think that means? So just based on the word participatory democracy, what do you think that means? Okay, so I'll keep going and hopefully, again, someone can type in the chat. But a participatory democracy is basically when citizens have the power to decide directly on policy. So it's not necessarily a direct democracy, but the citizens have a lot of power in terms of what the policy is going to be, and the politicians are the ones that actually implement those decisions. So again, like I said, it's not direct because citizens still aren't making the decision. So they're not being the politicians. They still have politicians that represent them that make those decisions. So in terms of examples for this, referendums, ballot measures, small scale things, almost you can think about town hall meetings, stuff like that. All of these are ways where a participatory democracy is in place. The United States is not a complete participatory democracy. You'll see that we kind of borrow elements from almost all three. Okay, so the next type of democracy is a pluralist democracy. So hopefully this was a term that you learned. Plural, so like, a plural word is like something with like an S at the end, or like it's multiple. A pluralist democracy is when there's multiple groups involved. Okay, so organized groups compete with each other to influence policy. What is an example you can think of an organized group that competes to influence policy in the United States government or the United States political system? Yes, interest groups, perfect. So interest groups are a prime example of how the pluralist democracy is at stake or is working in the United States. So activism is what drives these groups, so not necessarily a governmental interest or political interest to like gain office, but rather activism towards the cause. So they're very passionate about the cause and they want to make sure that what they believe in is implemented in the government. So like you guys said, interest groups is an example. They lobby and testify in Congress with congressional hearings in order to either stop or shape legislation. So it could go either way. Do you guys know any examples of interest groups? All right, we'll talk about them again later in the presentation. But I mean, you probably won't need to know like a specific example, but it's always important to kind of have an idea. So last year's concept-based FRQ was actually on interest groups. They talked about it was like something related to policy and interest groups, so they kind of tied in both. However, obviously this year they're not really going to cover the policy as much. So yeah. Are interest groups the same as factions? No. Well, yes and no. Factions is kind of like an old word that was used like in Federalist 10, where they said factions would be dangerous. Well, they kind of said it both ways in terms of how the Federalists said it and then the Anti-Federalists said it. However, interest groups are kind of I'd say a representation of factions in our government today. So interest groups are the people, so they're not necessarily politicians, and they work to influence policy. In terms of factions, they were talking about like majority and minority factions, and in my interpretation, what I think that means is more so groups of people that strongly believe in something, and if there's a lot more of them, then they're going to outweigh the opinions of people that don't. So they're almost talking about like voting blocks. Like there's a larger group of people that votes for this political party and a smaller group of people that votes for another political party. Interest groups, I mean, I guess you could categorize interest groups that way. However, like if you think about it, there's no majority interest group and minority interest groups, because interest group isn't involved in politics. Does that make sense? And when I say they're not involved in politics, I mean like in actual like legislation. Like they don't actually legislate. Okay, so continuing on with the types of democracy, the next type of democracy is the elite or elitist type of democracy. Basically, it's when a small group of people makes decisions for a large population. So generally, the people that are making these decisions are people with influence, people that are wealthy, stuff like that. This is almost something you can think about is the electoral college. Now, at this or in modern days, the people that are a part of that electoral college are probably not all wealthy, and don't form like part of that elite. However, in terms of what the electoral college is, it is a small group of people that make the decision for the population. So although we know the electoral college like kind of votes with the states, they are still a small group of people. So we don't directly elect the president. So that's something to think about with elite democracy. The sample FRQ that AP or College Board released when this new syllabus came out, which was last year, the argumentative essay was about this topic. So it was about the three types of democracy and how they, like which one best represented what the founders wanted. So you had to use the foundational documents to justify. Okay, so in terms of the types of democracy, there is debate now as to how everything should be interpreted. So the Constitution, Federalist 10, and Brutus 1 all reflect the tension between these theories of democracy. So again, if you've taken a U.S. history class, you know about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Everyone wanted democracy, so no one wanted a monarchy. However, they were debating how much power the federal government should have. So in terms of the Anti-Federalists, they felt that it should be like all power to the states and not any power to the federal government, whereas the Federalists felt the opposite way. In terms of why the Anti-Federalists felt that way, they had just come out of Britain where they were so controlled and yeah, like they were controlled and they didn't have barely had any rights, and that was the whole reason they got out of Britain. They didn't want to go into another monarchy where the president basically became the king. So that was kind of their fear and what they didn't want, and that's why you can see so much resistance with the anti-federalists. Okay, so that is the end of 1.2. Does anyone have any questions in terms of types of democracy or what we've talked about so far? All right, so let's go ahead and move into 1.3, which is government power and individual rights. So again, this topic is going to focus a lot on federalists and anti-federalists, and then we're also going to start talking about the foundational documents. So like I said, federalists favored strong federal government, weak state government. The people that were the federalists were mostly landowners and wealthy people. And on the other hand, anti-federalists, as I'm sure you can guess, favored a stronger state government, weaker federal government, and the people were poor that supported the anti-federalists. They demanded a Bill of Rights, which the Federalists said if they ratified the Constitution, a Bill of Rights would be added. That was kind of like their compromise, which again we'll see. We have a ton of compromises in our history, some good, some not so good. The anti-federalists taught the Constitution would create an elite type of democracy. So we talked about just now how in an elitist democracy, a small group of people makes decisions for the rest. So they really didn't want that, again, just because they just come out of Britain and they thought that wouldn't work here in America, which is why their opinions were that way. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the first foundational document. The first foundational document that we're going to talk about is Federalist 10. So in terms of what the Federalist Papers were, there were a series of 85 essays, and they were written by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, basically advocating for the ratification of the Constitution. In Federalist 10, Madison argued that factions are undesirable, so like you wouldn't want them, but they're inevitable because basically people are different. Federalist 10, and what College Board wants you to know, like straight from their standards, is that Madison's arguments in that document focused on how a larger republic would be better in terms of controlling the mischiefs of faction, is what he said. And he believed that delegating authority to representatives and dispersing power between states and the national government was a good thing. He also basically kind of went against the idea that a Republican form of government would only work if it's like a small country or like a small area. And he argued that the United States, like it being so big, would actually fragment that political power and make sure that there was not an elitist type of democracy. Okay, so that's kind of straight from College Board what they want you to know. In terms of some of the notes that I've taken, these notes, basically the reason why they're kind of blurry is because it's a screenshot. So those notes are the notes that I took before my AP exam. I mean, obviously I couldn't use them because it was not open note, but those are what like I studied off of in terms of the foundational documents. So you'll see a little bit more of these images as we go on through the presentation. Main idea, again, factions and talking about factions and why a large republic is best to control them. So again, like I said before, the whole point and the whole reason why he said that factions could be controlled was because the United States was going to be so big, it would fragment that political power, and it would also make sure that, or we could also control their effects. Okay, so if you look on the bottom of that screen, you can see that it says factions are inevitable. So human nature will cause people to join forces with people that believe the same things, and there's two ways to control factions. One is remove their causes. What that means, or in terms of what he was saying, is that people are all different. So if you were trying to remove the causes, that means you'd have to remove the differences between people. And that's practically impossible because everyone has different opinions. In order to control their effects, that was a path that you could go to. So if there was a majority faction, it won't be able to assert itself because of like the representative type of democracy and it being a Republican style of government. In terms of minority faction, I'm sorry. And then in terms of a majority faction, it would be mitigated by the representative government and then also the size and population of the union. So again, this is something that I would recommend you read. So actually read Federalist 10 before you take your exam so that you're not completely confused when you do get to the exam. So yeah, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. The next slide we're going to move into is Articles of Confederation. So before we start 1.4, does anyone have questions on standard 1.3, which was basically the foundational documents? All right, so let's go ahead and start 1.4. So in terms of the challenges of the Articles of Confederation, it's a trashy constitution, okay? It's terrible and it doesn't work. And they made some bad decisions. So basically, the Articles of Confederation established 13 different countries. They had like different currencies, and like it was really just a whole mess. It was a very weak federal government. There was only one branch, so only the legislative branch, no judicial branch, no executive branch, no taxation. We'll talk a little bit more about Shays' Rebellion and why that demonstrated the strong or need for a strong national government. Also, in terms of representation, every state had one vote. So all 13 colonies had, or well, I guess states now had one vote. And then in order to actually like get a law passed, basically 75% of the states had to agree. Now, you know, in Washington now, it's hard enough to get like 40% of Congress to agree. And imagine getting 75% of the states to agree. So that was kind of a difficulty that was presented with the Articles of Confederation. So, like I said, epic failure. In your words, what is a constitution? So if you had to define what a constitution was, what is it? So hopefully all 6 of you guys that are here can participate and give me a definition of what you guys think a constitution is. Okay, so hopefully this just means you guys are all typing great essays in the chat. But in terms of what a constitution is, it provides a basis for law, right? The Articles of Confederation were the first constitution, right? It's a law of the United States, but in terms of being very general about what a constitution is, yes, 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 yes. Great job. A set of articles and outlines as to the powers and responsibilities for government along with the rights of the people. Right. So what Jeff Page is saying is correct, just being general. And then what Michael and Sandra said is also correct, being more specific to the United States, right? So we consider our Constitution the law, the supreme law of the land in the United States. In terms of just what a constitution is, it just provides the laws of a government, the responsibilities of a government, what the government can do, what they can't do. Okay, so the Articles of Confederation really was the first constitution. Okay, so it was just a different name for the Constitution. Right, so it established a firm league of friendship. So they were all friends. A state, like in terms of making sure that there's national unity, there was no such thing because the federal government was so weak. So that's why they were all firm league of friendship. So you can see how they kind of set themselves up for failure. So there was a unicameral Congress, so there was no like differentiation between population and not population. And each state had one vote. And like I said before, the only branch of government that existed was the legislative branch. The other thing, Congress couldn't levy taxes, so that's the federal government doesn't get money. I know they kind of like what they did was like they were like asked the states and they were like, can you give us money? And the small states were like, oh well, the big states can give you money. The big states were like, I don't want to give you money. So you can see that if Congress can't levy taxes, then this whole purpose of government is defeated. Additionally, they had no means of enforcing because if you know what the responsibilities of each of the branches are, the executive branch enforces, the legislative branch makes the laws, the judicial branch interprets the laws. The legislative branch can make the laws all they want. However, if there's no executive to actually enforce those laws and make sure they're applicable to the people, then it's really no use. So that's why, again, epic failure. No power of commerce, and then in order to change, there had to be a unanimous vote, which again, 100% is so rare now, and I would assume it was the same then. In terms of what actually caused people to start doubting the Articles of Confederation, it was Shays' Rebellion. So it was a bunch of Massachusetts farmers that were losing their land. They were a lot of them were veterans. They couldn't pay their debt. They had kind of been promised that their war debts would be taken care of by the government in exchange for being in the war. However, that did not happen. So they wanted to end their misery, and they basically rebelled. They forced judges to close their courts, and it was a big mess. So that demonstrated that if the federal government needed to be strong enough to put down such rebellions, and it showed how weak the central government was because they couldn't do that for Shays' Rebellion. Okay, so that's all for 1.4. 1.4 was Articles of Confederation. Does anyone have any questions in terms of that? Okay, so let's go ahead and move into topic 1.5, which is the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Before we get started, what are some compromises that you know happened before the ratification of the Constitution? So there were several, but what are some you know? The Great Compromise, yes. Anything else? There was one specific one that, yes, with slaves, the 3/5 compromise. Okay, the Electoral College was also kind of a compromise. And then there was a compromise on the importation of slaves to the United States. Do you think the Constitution, yes, so well, the Virginia and New Jersey, they were not really compromises, they were plans, and then the Great Compromise combined the two. So neither of those were the compromise, they created the compromise. So do you think the Constitution resolved all problems that existed in terms of what the Articles of Confederation could not do? No, right? Because we still face those problems today, and the Supreme Court is constantly having to interpret the Constitution with modern challenges, right? So the Constitution in no way was a tell-all, like it didn't involve or didn't explain every single thing, in a long way, a written out way, so that people could understand. However, it did create a very unique system of government, and something that you guys can think about, even I think about it, is that like they created it so like perfectly. If you think about it, they created three branches of government, and they knew how to do all of this without much inspiration. We talked about those Enlightenment thinkers in terms of Montesquieu, with separation of powers and things like that. But it's still kind of interesting to see how all of that they just thought up at this constitutional convention, and now that's what we live with over 300 years later, right? So let's get going. Oh, and they talked about the amendment process. So that's something that we will consider with this standard as well. So 1.5 covers all the compromises and then the amendment process. So in terms of what DePace was saying in terms of the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan, what do you guys know about the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan? What were the differences in between them? Right. So Virginia plan wanted proportional representation, basically based on population. And the New Jersey plan wanted equal representation. Yes, Sandra, you're also correct. Same thing. One supported more populated states, the other supported equal representation because those states were less populated. Okay, so the Great Compromise helped to combine these two. Again, like I said, Virginia plan helped large states, and New Jersey plan helped small states. Basically, another name for it is the Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise. You will also hear the name Sherman and Johnson. Both of them were involved in the creation of this plan. They created a bicameral legislature. Yes, one of them called for a bicameral Congress, the other called for a unicameral Congress. And you can see a more specific breakdown right here. So yeah, New Jersey called for a unicameral and Virginia called for a bicameral. Obviously, we took that bicameral idea and we combined the proportional representation from Virginia and then the equal representation from New Jersey. And that's what the Great Compromise was. So hopefully this is an easy question. Which House of Congress is equal representation and which House of Congress is representation based on population? Exactly. Senate is equal and House of Representatives is proportional. Yes, Senate is 2 per state. So yeah, good job. That's really the main thing you need to know about the Great Compromise. The next compromise is the 3/5 compromise. Basically, what the framers said was that all free people, so basically all white people, would count as one person, and then all slaves, they basically just said 3/5 of others would be counted for representation. So, in terms of your view or what you think, who do you think wanted slaves to be counted as a full person, the South or the North? Right. Well, actually, Anika's right for this. Anika and Sandra are right. South. Because ironically, even though the South probably treated all the slaves as not human at all, they were the ones that wanted the slaves to be counted as a whole person because they had more slaves, right? The North didn't really have as many slaves. So if the South um, included the slaves in their count for population, they'd have more representation in the House of Representatives, right? So that's why the South wanted to count the slaves as part of their count. However, the compromise between the North and the South was that all slaves would be counted as 3/5. So does that make sense in terms of why the South wanted um, the one whole person? All right. Basically, later the 3/5 compromise is over when the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. In terms of importation of slaves, there was a limit placed on importation. Really not too important in terms of what you would cover in AP Gov. However, it did have an impact on how many slaves came to the United States. The next thing that I want to talk about is the amendment process. There's 2 processes in our in what we study that I find confusing, and they are really 3. The amendment process, the impeachment process. Those 2 are just hard to remember. They're not confusing in terms of understanding, but they're just hard to remember because there's so many possibilities really. And then iron triangles and issue network. So I think we will talk about those next week, or maybe they're in unit 2. But in terms of what the amendment process is, I would make sure, well, I guess you guys don't have multiple choice, but it is still possible you'll have a question on this. This was a question on the multiple choice last year where they did ask, they were like, which one of these is correct in terms of, I don't know, proposing and ratifying amendments, like the amendment process. So even though this is kind of a small fact, it is important that you kind of remember these things. This really, the best thing you can do is just memorize it. In terms of how an amendment is proposed, either there's a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress, or there's a 2/3 state legislatures call for a national convention. So if 2/3 of all 50 states decide they want to propose an amendment, then they would call for the convention. I'm pretty sure this is the only way that it's happened through both houses of Congress. And then in terms of ratification, it's either 3/4 approval of all state legislatures or 3/4 approval at a state convention. Now, obviously, this process is better than having all 50 states. Well, I guess it wasn't 50 then, but all states agree in terms of how to amend the Constitution, because at that point, nothing would ever happen, right? Nothing would change. But this makes sure that the majority is still in agreement. However, those minority groups are still being satisfied. Okay. The last thing that one of the last thing that this standard addresses is in terms of the role of the central government and how that has changed with events, and how there's a debate over the role of central government, state government, and individual rights. This is the same as the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists in terms of their disagreements in terms of who should have the power. With this, in terms of surveillance with 9/11, that caused a huge increase in the power of the federal government. There was the Homeland Security Department that was created. That was like a part of the executive branch, a whole new cabinet department. So that was important. And surveillance, that the government's power to do surveillance on individual citizens, possibly fragmenting individual rights or rights that we have, was determined to be better for the safety of all people. So that kind of again goes back and relates to our social contract theory and some of those Enlightenment ideas where it has to be good for the population. Then also in terms of public school education, in terms of who is in charge of schools, that is the state. However, the federal government is involved if it's a public school, right? Because you could see in Engel versus Vitale when the Supreme Court ruled the way they did. This is just a neat graphic that I found about how stuff happened or stuff changed after 9/11. So you can see there was a definite increase in surveillance just at the airport. So before 9/11, the check baggage screening, or how much of our check baggage was screened, was only 5%. Like, can you imagine that? Only 1/20th, one out of every 20 check bags was checked. After 9/11, every single check bag is checked, for whatever. In terms of the TSA budget, you can see in 2001, basically nothing, and you can see how much it increased throughout time. Again, before and after 9/11, you can see more, not really in terms of government related, but more statistics down here. Okay, so does anyone have any questions in terms of 1.5? Okay, so let's go ahead and move into 1.6. Sorry, I was trying to figure out if that yes was from yes, I have questions or from before. Sorry. So in terms of 1.6, while I'm talking, I would go ahead and look at this checks and balances chart. Maybe take a picture if you don't have one in your notes, because that is going to be important. The separation of powers, as you guys know, there's three branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. Legislative is addressed in Article 1, executive in Article 2, and judicial in Article 3. There are checks and balances that are in place, and these are some of them. So again, College Board wants you to know these checks and balances, so I'm just going to go over a few. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but I do want to go over some. So these are some of the notes that I've taken in terms of which ones are important. So in terms of the legislative and the executive, Congress can make laws, but the president can veto an act of Congress. The president negotiates treaties, and they must be ratified by the Senate. A way that the president can get around that is making an executive agreement. Basically, it's an informal treaty, and it's not binding since the Senate doesn't have to confirm it. However, it is a way that foreign policy can kind of work. The House of Representatives can impeach the president, and then the Senate can convict and remove the president. We saw the impeachment part just recently in American politics. In terms of the legislative and judicial branch, the Senate has the power to confirm or reject nominations to the Supreme Court. Congress can propose a constitutional amendment to reverse the Supreme Court ruling. So if they don't agree with the Supreme Court ruling, one way is to propose an amendment. Now, is that likely, or is that going to happen? Probably not, but that is a way, or that is a check and balance. In terms of executive and judicial, the president has the power to nominate justices to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court can use their important power of judicial review to declare acts by the other houses, by the other branches, unconstitutional. And then impeachment is kind of a way in which the legislative branch exercises control over all the other branches. So impeachment is, you should also be familiar with that process. I believe the actual process and the numbers come into play in Unit 2, but this unit just talks about impeachment and how that's a form of checks and balances. The next slide is talking about more principles of government in Federalist number 51. So before we actually get to this slide, what do you guys know about Federalist 51? Which branch of government does it deal with mainly? No, judicial is 78. Executive is 70. 51 is actually your legislative branch. So it talks about legislative branch and some more checks and balances. So that's kind of the theme here. In terms of Federalist 51, the main thing they talked about, really, I guess you guys were right in terms of judicial and executive. It focuses a lot on separation of powers and checks and balances. However, the main one for executive is going to be 70. Main one for judicial is going to be 78. 51 talks about separation of powers, and the purpose of this is to have ambition that counteracts ambition. And it said that each power should work independently of each other, so they shouldn't influence each other too much. However, they should have powers over each other, or checks, just in case one branch got too powerful. Okay. It also said that all branches should not be elected by the people. Which branches of government do we directly elect? Right. The legislative branch is actually the only branch that we directly elect. Who elects the president in terms of the executive branch? Right, exactly. So the Electoral College elects the president. We directly elect the legislative branch, so our senators and our representatives, and then the judicial branch is not elected at all. So he talked about how judges should not be elected because they should serve without political pressure. That's why they have life terms. Okay. Again, kind of an interesting quote. He, in terms of checks and balances, he said, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." Talking about how people would want power. Okay. Again, he said power should be divided but not equal, and his argument was that Congress should be the most powerful. So this is kind of where I got that legislative thing from. And he said they're elected by the people but divided, so that's one way. And then in terms of being divided, they are bicameral, so they could check themselves. So if one, I guess, house of Congress was getting too strong, the other could check itself. And you can see that with our process of how a bill becomes a law, right? It has to pass through both houses of Congress in order to get to the president's desk. So that's the main stuff that you should know with Federalist 51. Okay, so that was 1.6. That was kind of a big standard. Does anyone have any questions for that? All right, so we're going to move into our last topic. So the next three standards are all about federalism. So can anyone tell me what federalism is or describe what federalism is? Correct. So federalism is the balance of power between state and national government. So basically, to what extent federal government has power, or to what extent the state government has power. Yes, also correct, Sandra. So just a relationship between national and states. So one thing that I found interesting that I wanted to talk about is these three systems of government. So a unitary system is basically when the authority is concentrated within the central government, and then it kind of goes down to the states. So examples of this would be the UK, Japan, Sweden. And I'm assuming if any of you guys have taken comparative government, I haven't, but I believe they focus a lot more on how the governments of, I think, 7 different countries compare. So that's an interesting class if you ever want to take it. In terms of what a federation is, that's when the authority is divided between the central and state governments, and then it's derived from the people. So that's basically what we are in terms of the United States. A confederation is when the authority is concentrated in the states, and then it goes towards the national government. Great example of this, Articles of Confederation, and we can see how that turned out, right? So I believe, I'll give you a statistic later, but I think it's like only 11 countries or something have a federalist system of government. So I thought that was interesting. Again, in terms of what federalism is, it's a system of government where power is divided between the central and regional governments. So this doesn't necessarily have to mean a state government. It can also mean like a local government or regional government. It's when 2 or more levels have formal authority over the same people. So it's like the same citizens. So for example, I am a resident of North Carolina. So the state governor of North Carolina has authority over what I do, and so does the president because he rules the entire country. Yeah. So it helped balance the worries of Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Remember, Anti-Federalists wanted power to the states. Federalists wanted power to the national government. Federalism is a good way to compromise with that. There are several types of powers. So let's try and define each one of these. What is the difference between all five? So expressed, implied, inherent, reserved, and concurrent. So if somebody wants to do each one, or you can. How about we do express? So what are express powers? Exactly. So Anika, you're right. Express powers are explicitly stated in the Constitution. You can point to it in the Constitution. That's how an express power is derived. Where does an implied power come from? Right. It's implying the wording of the Constitution. It's not directly stated in the Constitution. Kind of comes from the necessary and proper clause, or you've heard of it as the elastic clause, and it gives Congress the power to make all laws that shall be necessary and proper um, to basically carry out the other laws that are presented in the Constitution. So it comes from the Constitution, but it's not actually stated there. In terms of what inherent powers are, that's kind of confusing, but it's basically coming from the fact that the United States is a nation. So it's like the U.S. can make treaties, they can wage war, they can acquire new territory. All of those come under inherent powers. You probably won't be tested on that. It's just good to know, I guess, if you're trying to eliminate wrong answers, especially if there was a multiple choice section. In terms of what reserve powers come from the state. And this is something that you can see through the 10th Amendment. Some reserve powers include establishing public schools, establishing local government, stuff like that. And then concurrent powers, kind of like just from the word, like concurrent together, they're exercised by both the national and the state government. So the enforcing laws, that is a concurrent power, the power to tax, establishing courts, those are all examples of concurrent powers. All right, so the next few slides are going to talk about the different types of federalism. So the first type is dual federalism, and it's basically when national and state governments are in their own separate spheres. So they don't interfere with each other, and they kind of work by themselves. National government carries out their responsibilities, state government carries out its responsibilities. This is something that if I'm hoping you've heard this analogy, this could be known as layer cake federalism. Basically, if you see like a layer cake, there's clear separation between each of the layers. So clear separation between state government responsibilities and federal government responsibilities. For example, federal government is responsible for foreign policy. States are responsible for establishing public schools. A state isn't going to go through and make foreign policy, and the federal government isn't going to establish public schools because they don't follow or they don't fall under those categories. So if it was dual federalism, this would be the situation. Okay. The next type is marble cake federalism. In a marble cake, it's all mixed together, right? You can't really see. I mean, I guess you can see, but you can't see clear levels of distinction like you can with the layer cake. So it's basically when the federal government and the state government work together to do stuff. The formal name for this is cooperative federalism. And examples of this could include like interstate highway programs. A lot of stuff that happens in the United States now is cooperative federalism. And yeah, like I said, there's a blurred distinction. So if you want to see the graphic, there it is. In terms of layer cake federalism being a clear delineation of authority, and then the marble cake federalism or cooperative federalism being a mixing of authority between national, state, and local. All right, the last type, I believe, of federalism that we're going to talk about is fiscal federalism. Fiscal federalism is talking about spending, taxing, providing grants, all that stuff, anything money related. Fiscal federalism is a type of cooperative federalism, which means the state government and the national government work together. Revenue sharing is a term that you might hear. It's basically anything that's funded by the national or local government. Some key words that you want to know are categorical grants, block grants, and mandates. So what is the difference between Okay, I have a question. Would McCulloch versus Maryland be a good SCOTUS example of marble cake? Yeah, yes and no. Can you explain why you like think it would be, or like your logic behind that? Because I don't know how you would tie in like the concept of marble cake federalism there. Really, that talks more about the supremacy clause and how the state government is not superior to the federal government. All right, so I'll go ahead and keep talking about fiscal federalism, and hopefully you can type your response, and then I'll be able to see it. So, in terms of what fiscal federalism is, these are three words you should be aware of: categorical grants, block grants, and mandates. Here's an interesting graphic. Well, I guess not interesting. It's an informative graphic that shows you the differences between categorical and block grants. Categorical grants is something that the states do not like. So the money can only be used for a specific purpose. Whereas block grants, it's more general. They don't give you like a specific reason for that money. States obviously like this more because they can use it for other stuff, right? So they could use it as they see fit and customize it to their own state. In terms of which one is more effective, I mean, I guess that's debatable. Again, states, one thing you should really just know from this is that states prefer block grants because it gives them more freedom. All right, the last thing that I want to talk about is a mandate. A mandate is basically the instructions the state needs to follow. It tells the states you have to do this. One word that you might hear is an unfunded mandate. An unfunded mandate basically means that the state and the local government has to provide resources, but then no federal funds are required. So as you can guess or assume, obviously states do not like this because they're not given any money to satisfy what the federal government says must happen, right? Okay. So nothing yet checked. Okay, so does anyone have any questions in terms of 1.7 and federalism with that? Okay, so 1.8 is going to talk about the supremacy clause, and here we are going to talk about McCulloch versus Maryland. Okay, so in Article 6, the supremacy clause basically asserts the national authority over the states, and it says the U.S. Constitution is supreme. It says that the federal law will always go over the state law if there's a conflict between the two. Another way in which the federal government has been able to increase their power is through the Interstate Commerce Clause. Basically, by now, telephone messages, financial transactions, all of those go under Commerce Clause. And again, increase the power of the federal government. Like we talked about before, Necessary and Proper Clause also increases the power of the federal government because it basically says Congress can make laws that will help it satisfy all of those other needs or what's required with the express powers in the Constitution. Okay, so in terms of McCulloch versus Maryland, and I know Joe Page asked about this, but I'm not sure how you connected it to marble cake. With McCulloch versus Maryland, basically there was a bank that was chartered in Maryland, and then like 2 years later, Maryland decided they would pass a law that imposed taxes on that bank. The national bank or the federal bank decided not to pay that tax, and then the state court ruled that the bank itself was unconstitutional, and the federal government couldn't just charter a bank in their state. In terms of what the issues were, it was basically, does Congress have the implied power to create a national bank, and could states tax the federal government or a federal bank? Based on in terms of what the judicial branch, Supreme Court concluded, based on the necessary and proper clause, they said that Congress isn't limited by its express powers, and because of Congress's implied powers, they did have the ability to create a bank. Congress also concluded that based on supremacy clause, national government outweighs the state government, and that's why states are not allowed to tax the federal government. Again, in terms of what an implied power is, it expands upon the expressed or enumerated powers that are listed in the Constitution. So, for example, they can borrow and coin money, they can tax by the Constitution, so a bank helps them do that. Yeah, so a layer cake would probably work better there because the national government did outline their case in terms of authority. So in terms of supremacy clause, basically they said the federal law supersedes the state law. All right, the next case that was also talked about in the standards for this 1.8 section is U.S. versus Lopez. So in terms of the summary, there was a high school senior who decided to take a weapon to school, and the way they imposed charges was under the Commerce Clause. So they said it violated the Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990, and what it did was it stopped the use of firearms or possession of firearms within school zones, and the reason was a Commerce Clause. Now, I'm sure we can all agree that, well, some of us can agree that students having guns on campus might not be the best idea, but the way in which they implemented this law was through the Commerce Clause. Now, the issue was, is that allowed in terms of why is it a Commerce Clause, right? Because the Commerce Clause really is just expanding the federal government's power with every Supreme Court case that involves it. However, in this case, the law was considered unconstitutional because it really did not substantially affect interstate commerce, which is a provision in the Commerce Clause. And like you can see from this quote right here, the case introduced a new phase of federalism that recognized the importance of state sovereignty and local control. So it really made sure that the states had more power. It's part of a movement called devolution that we will talk about on this slide, I believe. So does anyone have any questions about section 1.8 and the constitutional interpretations of federalism? All right, so let's go ahead and move on to 1.9, which is the last standard in this unit. Devolution is a process. Basically, it's moving the powers of the federal government to the state government. So basically increasing state power. Generally favored by Republicans because, as you guys know, hopefully, Republicans favor more state control, and then Democrats favor more federal control. And it relates to the U.S. versus Lopez case because, like you can see, the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to make the law based on the Commerce Clause when it really didn't impact interstate commerce. Okay, so in terms of the advantages of federalism, this is a quote that College Board provides, and it's kind of confusing. They said multiple access points for stakeholders and institutions to influence public policy flows from the allocation of powers between the national and the state government. What this basically means is that federalism allows for, first of all, diverse policies. It can encourage experimentation. So like one state can try it out, and if that works, then maybe the federal government can try it out. It provides multiple points where people can influence public policy. And different economic interests. So like each state is different, right? So what a North Carolinian wants might be different from what a New Yorker wants, especially in times like these, right? So those economic interests are different in different states. And so the federal system makes sure that those states' particular needs are taken care of. Also, it decentralizes any political conflict, and political parties are able to function at multiple levels. So like if the political party loses the federal election, that doesn't mean the entire, United States is now going to move with that political party, if that makes sense. In terms of the disadvantages of federalism, that's something that we can probably just name off the top of our heads. It just causes gridlock and more time for stuff to get done. Additionally, it might promote inequality since states differ in the amount of resources they can provide towards a certain issue. And it might create confusion, right? So it might be difficult for citizens to know what the state government and federal government are requiring of them, especially if they conflict. So sometimes laws do conflict, and that's when they go to the Supreme Court. And often the federal government wins because of the supremacy clause. So that's all of the standards that are in Unit 1. The 9 standards are outlined here. So again, we talked about democracy, ideals of democracy, the 3 types of democracy. We talked about some key foundational documents in terms of the Federalist Papers, Articles, and Constitution. We talked about several principles of the United States government, including a review of Federalist 51 and checks and balances. Finally, we ended with federalism. So, does anyone have any questions in terms of anything we've covered so far in this stream about Fiveable, about your AP exam? One thing that I do want to mention, Fiveable has this new initiative starting back up called Fiveable Olympics. If you pre-register for that, you can form a team of 4, and you'll be able to win points and I think win a pretty good prize, like some kind of iPad or some cool prize. So I definitely recommend checking that out. I forgot to put the slide in this stream. However, if you look up Fiveable Olympics, you'll be able to see all of that. Again, this is next week. I'll be back with a Unit 3 review in terms of civil liberties and civil rights. So it'll be similar to this one in terms of each standard getting a set of slides. I'll make sure to outline anything. One thing that I do want to address is that if you have questions about civil liberties, about anything AP before the exam, if you go to the stream in Fiveable, there's a little discussion board underneath. You can submit any questions before the stream so that I can put them in the presentation and make sure you address them. So let's say you aren't going to be able to make it to the stream, but you still have questions. You can add them in that discussion, and then I'll answer them in the stream so that when you watch the replay, you'll be able to see your answers. Okay. Again, does anyone else have any other questions in terms of AP Gov, Unit 1, anything like that? In the United States versus Lopez, what the court ruled. So if we go back to this slide. All right, so this is a ruling in terms of U.S. versus Lopez. Basically, they ruled on the side of the kid with the gun. Basically, they said that because the federal government didn't have the power to legislate under the Commerce Clause to that extent, because the school zone really isn't interstate commerce, and having a gun in the school zone doesn't affect interstate commerce. Therefore, that law, the law that said he couldn't have that gun, was unconstitutional. So it went in favor of the kid. Does that make sense? All right. So I think the only Supreme Court case out of your required 15 that is not going to be covered on the exam is the Citizens United, because that comes in Unit 4 or 5. I'm pretty sure the rest are all in Units 1, 2, or 3. The court cases for Unit 1, I'm pretty sure the only 2 are McCulloch versus Maryland and U.S. versus Lopez, because both of them deal with federalism. A majority of them come under Unit 3, I believe. If you go to it's like the most important Supreme Court cases. It was the stream I did earlier in the year. You'll be able to find all of them. We'll talk about all the Unit 3 cases next week. But I think the only ones that are outlined for Unit 1 in the syllabus are McCulloch versus Maryland and U.S. versus Lopez. So does anyone else have any questions or concerns, or questions about Fiveable? What we provide, AP. If you've seen me streaming before, we've streamed for APES. I stream for APES and AP Gov, so you can ask me really any questions. Do you have any tips on how to remember the main things from the Constitution in terms of like the clauses, or like what do you mean? Also remember that your exam is open note. So one thing that I would recommend is making like 1-pagers for each of the documents. So yeah, so what I would recommend is taking like 1 page, so just 1 page, and outlining everything you need to know about the Constitution on that 1 page. So that could be which articles are which. If you think about it in terms of just like the order of the articles, 1, 2, and 3, the most important, or the one that is necessary, is, well, all of them are necessary, but the most important and the one that's closest to the people is the legislative branch. That's why it's Article 1. The next one is the one you think about the most, the president. The next one is the one that you don't think about but interprets the law. So that's the judiciary branch. what I would make sure you do is outline everything you need to know or think is important that you could use as evidence in your FRQ, and put it on like one piece of paper, and have one piece of paper for each of the foundational documents. Yeah, so if you go back and watch the most recent AP Gov Q&A, I went through and showed you what I used to study for my AP exam. So it was like a 4-page document, and it had all of the important points from each of the foundational documents. So I would recommend you make something like that so that you can use it as notes on the AP exam, or just make a Quizlet, something like that. All right, does anyone else have any questions? All right, if that's it, thank you very much for attending today and being active participants. I hope to see you again next week. Make sure all of your AP Gov friends, anyone that's taking AP Government, come, because this is a free review. AP Government, we don't have as many streamers, so we don't have as many free reviews. So I'd really appreciate if you guys could come and get you guys ready for the AP exam. So have a great night, everyone, and hope you guys are all staying safe.